The second domain that's most often studied in the literature is memory. So memory impairments, again, very common in Alzheimer's disease, and as well as those individuals with memory impairments typically will convert to dementia when they have mild cognitive impairment, which I will talk a little bit more later in the talk. Okay, so in terms of aerobic training, what I really want to quickly summarize or flag is a series of studies done by a group of US researchers led by Art Kramer, who is in Champaign, Illinois, and he truly is probably the world expert on the role of aerobic training in the promotion of brain health. And so even back in 2004, they published a beautiful study that looked at the effect of 6 months of 3 times a week aerobic training, which really, again, was a walking program. So people were not running. They were walking at a moderate pace that progressively got faster over the 6 months, but generally it was still a moderate pace. Okay? And after 6 months, what they found was that aerobic training 3 times a week did improve executive functions, and as well, it improved brain function as measured by functional MRI. So functional MRI is quite different than what I think most of you would typically get, which is if you do get an MRI, you go in, you're asked to lie really still, they take a picture of your brain, and then you leave the scanner. Within a functional MRI, you go into the same scanner, but you actually have to do things in there. So on the screen that you see on top of your head, you'll see different images or different tasks that you have to do, and typically you respond with your finger, either left or right, saying yes or no, or depending on the task that's being asked of you to do. So you're actually doing a task while your brain is being scanned. And what we do then is really look at how does the brain activate and how accurate are you performing while you're doing the task. So again, in this study, what they actually showed was that after 6 months of training, the brain actually is much more efficient in performing the task than prior to training. And they also actually show that after 6 months of training, you can actually grow the amount of brain matter you had. So brain atrophy, or the loss of brain volume, is a hallmark of aging, and rapid atrophy or loss of brain matter is a hallmark of neurodegeneration. So here, Art Kramer's group actually show that you can actually increase areas of the brain after 6 months of training. And again, these studies were, I would say, very significant when they first came out, and are still quoted very often in the literature and also in the media. And then the latest study they did that was published in 2011 really has, I think, significant relevance to Alzheimer's disease, because now what they have done is looked at the effect of a 12-month walking program, again, 3 times a week at a moderate pace. No one is sprinting, no one is racing to a finish line. We're talking about a moderate pace, and it's over 40 minutes. So they're all 1-hour sessions, but 10 minutes before is for warm-up, 10 minutes after is for cool-down, so we're really talking about 40 minutes. And even when you start, it's not a continuous 40 minutes, okay, depending on your fitness level. But again, just to reiterate, fairly manageable programs that did progress over time. So here what they actually showed was that 12 months of aerobic training was able to improve memory. And again, memory is most affected by dementia. But as well, they actually observed that with training, you can actually improve the hippocampus by 2%. Does anybody know what the hippocampus is within the brain? Anyone? Just out of curiosity. Yes. Yeah. You're trying to remember. That's good. I couldn't have said it better myself. So the hippocampus actually is a structure within the brain that is essential for memory formation and learning. And again, it tends to shrink with aging, and certainly in Alzheimer's disease, it shrinks rapidly. And here what they showed is after 12 months of training, you can actually grow the hippocampus by 2%. And my comment to this typically is 2% never sounds that impressive, right? Especially if you're talking about, let's say, your RSP returns, anything related to financial gains. 2% is pretty, non-impressive. But in terms of brain aging, it is very impressive. It's actually equivalent to reversing your brain age by up to 2 years. Very potent effects. okay, of exercise on brain structure. And the field of neuroscience is advancing really rapidly. So we are now having not only advanced neuroimaging techniques to look at the brain, but also advanced sort of analyses or approaches to look at how the brain functions. So in terms of brain function, in the past, we would look at what areas of the brain would light up. Okay, so again, you would be in the scanner, you'd be doing your task, and what we try to look for is how does your brain activate? So what areas of the brain is getting more blood flow because you're working that area of the brain. But now what we realize is that the brain is kind of like a very sophisticated orchestra or symphony. So imagine a symphony. It's only good when all its sort of components play together at the right time, right? So if the strings on this side versus the drums on this side are supposed to come together at this point in time, that's when you get the most beautiful music, right? It's very similar with the brain. To have optimal performance, we now realize it's not just so much what areas of the brain is lighting up and how much is lighting up, but how is it lighting up in accordance to other areas of the brain that also supports that particular function. So it's called orchestras, and is how I sort of explain it. But within neuroscience, we really talk about it as networks. And what we're actually now even realizing is that with aerobic training, you can actually improve brain function as we assess it through network connectivity, meaning that it actually can improve how different areas of the brain coordinate with each other to, again, achieve a particular task. And even more interestingly, in this particular paper by my colleague Michelle Foss, is that she found that with improved connectivity between the different networks, so again, different areas of the brain coordinating to achieve a common goal in the most optimal fashion, that increase was actually also highly associated with growth factors. And I just want to briefly talk about growth factors because very often I'm asked, well, how does exercise improve cognition? Well, growth factors is definitely one way. There's multiple paths that's sort of being talked about right now, but growth factors are produced in your body, they circulate in your blood, and they go into your brain, and they basically have lots of benefits. They can actually stimulate cellular growth, proliferation, and differentiation. In a nutshell, they're really good for your brain. And we know that with exercise, you can actually increase the levels of growth factors. And here, what we have shown is that the levels of growth factors is actually highly associated or related to improvements in brain function. And in terms of the application of exercise, and specifically aerobic training to dementia prevention, a very common question I then get asked is like, well, is it still useful for individuals who may already have some cognitive changes? So everything I've talked to you until now has really been done in what I would call otherwise healthy community-dwelling older adults who do not have any significant cognitive deficits. And what we're realizing with recent studies now is that the benefits of exercise do extend to those individuals who already have changes in their cognition. So they're early Alzheimer's or early dementia, or commonly called mild cognitive impairment, whereby they do have some cognitive issues, but they can still function fairly well within the community. But the relevance of demonstrating the benefit extending to this particular group is that for those individuals with MCI, we actually know that 50% will convert to having dementia within 5 years. So it is a group of individuals who are at particular risk for developing dementia. And here, in this particular study, they show that after 6 months of a walking program 4 times a week, you could improve cognition in this high-risk group. So, moving on, now what I'd like to talk about is the role of resistance training in terms of its benefit on brain health. So in terms of resistance training versus aerobic training, yes? Yes? Oh, I'm open to...
We'll only do questions at the end.
Oh, questions at the end. Okay. But I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have at the end for sure. So in terms of aerobic versus resistance training, if anyone has ever really looked at, the literature or sort of what's out there, most of us will recognize that aerobic training is the one that's been studied the most, partly because we know the mechanisms much better. So in terms of how does exercise promote cognition and brain health, we do rat studies, right? We get rats, we put them on a treadmill, get them to run, which is aerobic training. Then you can look at how they do certain mazes well, or hopefully better than before they were running on the treadmill. And then you can sacrifice them, look at their brains, and see how did they do as compared to those who didn't have access to a treadmill. So a very nice control study in looking at how does aerobic exercise improve brain health. Not so easy for looking at how strength training improves brain health, because it's pretty hard to devise an animal study where they're lifting weights, right? Rats has a natural inclination to run a little treadmill. If you put it in their cage, much harder to figure out how do you get them to lift weights. But people are actually trying to develop it because we do want to know whether the mechanisms are the same or potentially different as compared with aerobic training. So generally, resistance training has been studied much less so, but certainly we do know, sort of among other literature, that resistance training has a huge role in the promotion of healthy aging in terms of promoting brain health, reducing falls risk, and reducing fracture risk. And certainly for resistance training, as its application to cognition, it's been a focus in my research lab. So one of the first studies that was published that I thought was really nicely done was by a group in Brazil. And what they did is they looked at a 3 times a week resistance training protocol for 6 months. And they looked at both moderate and high intensity. And what they actually found was that both intensities, so both moderate and high, had benefit for both memory and executive functions. Which is great, right? So you would assume that the high intensity would be better than moderate, but they actually didn't show that. They actually show fairly equal benefits between the two intensities. But I also do want to flag that they only included men. And the reason they do that, and the reason we only include women thus far, is that there seems to be some interesting evidence or trend to suggest that women may actually benefit greater from exercise in terms of brain health than men. And that usually triggers a lot of questions as to the why. Lots of research into that. We're not sure why, but that actually is a trend that we're observing, and again, being somewhat repeated throughout different investigators and different studies. And so what we did in 2010 is publish a paper looking at resistance training in older women. So the first study that we published was in otherwise healthy older women, so they didn't have any significant cognitive issues. We included 155 women who were aged 65 to 75. And they were basically randomized to either twice a week resistance training or once a week resistance training, or a balance and tone group, which is really what we call an experimental control. And I want to talk about the control group a little bit, simply because often people think of control as in they don't do any exercise. So of course you're not going to do as well as those people who are receiving some exercise. In our studies, the control group actually are doing exercise, and I would argue they're doing exercises very similar to the classes that's being offered at the community. And I also want to emphasize, if you actually look at our data, the control group actually are maintaining their cognition throughout our trial rather than showing any sort of trend towards decline, which is what you would expect with normal aging. So hopefully this video will work. If not, we might have to move on. So this is a video taken from our balance and tone group, and I just want to show some of the exercises they did do, which is, wall squats, and they actually really enjoyed themselves. I don't know if you guys can hear. So they would do wall squats, which is still, again, a strengthener for the thighs, but as compared with the resistance training group, they simply didn't have external loading applied throughout the program. They also were doing lots of range of motion exercises. And I don't know if you can hear, but they actually started singing. So my point is that within our studies, at least,
that song for us. You did that other day. That was fantastic.
Oh yeah, I think they're singing now. Maybe. Oh yeah, they used to sing Tea for Two. And another reason why I show this video is to highlight that we also have these type of comparison groups because we want to control for things like socialization. So as you may recall at the very beginning of my presentation, I did talk about socialization as a key factor in the promotion of healthy aging, and I really do believe it's a factor. And so within our studies, when we're trying to tease out the effect of exercise versus socialization, we need to account for that. Okay, so this is our comparison group, and again, we do try to control for that, and as you can see, probably works pretty well in controlling for it.